Hello, good morning, welcome everybody. This is Duder. Welcome back to the den. So, very recently, a huge zeitgeist of media coverage has come out over Colossal Biosciences' brand new announcement of their dire wolves that they seemingly have brought back from de-extinction. This is apparently going to be a humongous leap in science and is sort of like uh, Colossal becoming the Jesus to the world's ecological Lazarus, bringing back these extinct megafaunal species back from the dead. Now, the problem with all that is that are these wolves that Colossal is showing off, what Times is showing off, are they actually dire wolves? Well, no. That is the short and sweet of it. These animals here, Romulus, Remus, and the very cute Khaleesi, are in fact not dire wolves. In fact, dire wolves themselves have no real, close relation to gray wolves at all, as of a 2021 peer-reviewed paper. Aniscion is the actual genus and species name of the dire wolf, and it is it's more accurate to call these animals dire dogs than dire wolves. Now, the actual Colossal Biosciences animals that have come out, they are gray wolves with modified genomes. And now I want to get in and actually, talk about the sort of science behind these animals. But before we do that, I want to actually talk about what Aniscion was, what the actual dire wolf was. So why don't we dive into that and sort of get a bit of a crash course as to what these extinct and just beautiful megafauna were before we actually talk about what Colossal is claiming their animals to be and what they actually are. Now, dire wolves were first described in 1858 by Joseph Leidy, and the original species was named Canis dirus. However, in 2021, genetic studies led to the reassignment of dire wolves to their own distinct genus of Aniscion, which is more closely related to, like I said, bush dogs and jackals. So these animals aren't actually wolves. They're cousins of wolves. They lived in, late Pleistocene North and South America, and were sort of like they were a humongous top dog predator. They were sort of the megafaunal versions of gray wolves, whereas gray wolves may have preyed upon smaller animals such as, light-bodied deer, wild boar, things like that. Aniscion was more of a top-tier sort of heavy-bodied or organism hunters. They're hunting things like bison, ancient horses, camels even, and things like ground sloths, mammoths, and mastodons. They were most likely going to be either, preying on the elderly or scavenging. They were known for having this immense bone-crushing sort of skull, very squat and wide. Their teeth was much wider and much more heavily built than some of their counterparts, which sort of lent credence to the idea that perhaps they were not only big active hunters, but also scavengers, sort of filling in a kind of hyena-esque role. They lived in, primarily shrubland, grassland, savanna areas that late Pleistocene North America was known for having. And they were most likely semi-open habitat hunters, akin again to hyenas or lions in the sort of open savanna grassland, jackals, versus the smaller counterparts, the regular Canis lupus, gray wolves, which are more specialized in living in forest environments, and their smaller and more nimble body structure led to more of a flexible kind of hunting style. Now, these animals are known very well in the fossil record. The La Brea tar pits have hundreds and hundreds of individuals of dire wolves, and found to have two separate, distinct subspecies. You have the Dirus dirus, which is the eastern dire wolf, and Dirus gauldiae, which is the western dire wolf, which seems to be the individual species that's found the most readily in the La Brea tar pits. Now, these animals, because there's such a wide swath of actual data in the form of skeletal remains and mummified tissue, we're able to actually take into account all the sort of genetic differences between the Canis genus and Aniscions genus. Now, unlike something like Canis lupus or Canis latrans, which is the coyote, there is no known interbreeding between Canis and the Canis genus, Canis lupus, so gray wolves, and dire wolves themselves. They're genetically distinct enough to where there hasn't really been that much interplay between the two of them. So it's thought that these guys were very much their own distinct isolated species. Now, morphologically, there is also, like I said earlier, the big difference between the head and the bone-crushing teeth. They also had shorter legs, and their skeleton overall was much more heavily built. These guys were built to be sort of like a bulldozer or a battering ram when it comes to these megafaunal prey they're taking down. These guys had bodies that could weigh between 130 and 150 pounds, and they stood about 2.5 feet tall at the shoulder. So these guys were pretty big. They were humongous compared to the modern gray wolf. Now, with all that being said, these guys, because they were so specialized, did eventually die out. Roughly 10,000 years ago, these animals sort of started to decline when, along with most of the rest of the world's megafaunal species, they also went extinct. This is due, again, because of the megafaunal species collapse that happened as a result of primary food sources going away, but also the arrival of us, humans, as well as things like competition with gray wolves, which were more adaptable to this sort of change in actual megafaunal distribution and prey distribution, as well as the climate change itself. The climate was warming at the end of the Pleistocene and into the Quaternary period. So a lot of these factors really just put the nail in the coffin for these big guys, and eventually they did die out. Now, this is sort of important to keep in mind because now we're taking into account what Colossal is doing with their animals. Now, unlike the original dire wolves or dire dogs, I will die on this hill. I do believe they should be called dire dogs as opposed to dire wolves. But these dire dogs, they are much different than anything we've really ever seen in modern media or modern memory when it comes to sort of large top tier predator canines. These guys are distinct enough to where they were not anything like gray wolves and were sort of their own thing. They derived from a common ancestor between jackals and gray wolves around 5 million years ago. That's what at least has been thought of. So what exactly are the animals that Colossal Biosciences is showing off as dire wolves? Well, they're just gray wolves. Now, the problem with what's going on with Colossal is a lot of miscommunication and a lot of just misinterpretation. There's a lot of rumors going around, so it's not necessarily the best to sort of say, yes, this is definitely what it is, until we actually have a peer-reviewed article that's been published. And as of the time of recording this video, that hasn't happened yet. So we're still waiting on an actual peer-reviewed article to be published by Colossal. Now, they have said on Twitter that they're going to produce it soon, and it's going to be published on, I believe it's BioX. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll throw up the picture when I find it, but that's what we know so far. I've heard myself, and I've seen and read different things. I've heard musings that, oh, they haven't used, they've used old Siberian wolf DNA. Um, they've sequenced genetic genomes from this. They've sequenced genetic genomes from that. Basically, what I know for sure, and what we as a collective group of people know for sure, at least on the internet, is that they've sequenced direwolf DNA. That we know for sure. That's already been done. And so what they've done is they've taken that DNA sequencing and they've sort of kind of done a sort of compare and contrast with the sequencing that they've found in these gray wolf genomes, and they've essentially mirrored what they've found in these ancient DNA sequences and sort of applied them to the gray wolf genome inside of Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi. Now, the thing with that is we don't really necessarily know entirely what dire wolves or true dire wolves, anti-cyan dire dogs look like. We have very good guesses based on living relatives, and we can sort of make a good enough picture, but we still don't entirely know. So these sort of genotypic and phenotypic expressions that we see in these living animals in Khaleesi, Romulus, and Remus, they could very well be the actual ancient genomes coming through and showing off what they actually did look like. Or they could also be just genetically engineered, for lack of a better term, theme park monsters, from Jurassic Park 3, like to quote Sam Neill's Alan Grant, or it's just sort of like a designer animal. Now, these three, albeit adorable puppies, they do represent, or at least resemble, the dire wolves seen in George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones. They're described as these large, gigantic white wolves. And that's exactly what Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi are. In fact, Khaleesi is named in honor of George R.R. Martin because he is also a shareholder in Colossal. So they could very well have just created, basing their genomes on these extinct animals, sort of like a tech bro-y kind of designer animal. We don't know for sure, and we won't know until they decide to publish and release a peer-reviewed article, or an article for peer review. So at the moment, I don't think it's very appropriate to be calling these animals dire wolves, because it's not what they are. In fact, I believe we shouldn't really be calling them kind of any sort of de-extincted animal, because it's not what they are at all. De-extinction is the concept of resurrecting an ancient species or one that's been extinct and bringing it back to the new world. That's not what Colossal seems to have done. They seem to have modeled an already existing species after a perceived version of an extinct animal and engineered them to appear that way. So I would say, and there's been quite the discourse on Twitter. We have people going back and forth, just clowning on Colossal. I'll throw up a couple different things that I saw, and making very, very good points as to these are just sort of like designer GMO puppies. So I believe on Instagram, someone who said it best was Biospeculo, who's an amazing artist. You should go follow him. And that these are not really gray wolves anymore either, because they've taken the gray wolf genome and sort of muddled it a bit and created their own sort of gray wolf thing. And so I think that these guys, I'm of the opinion, and I share this opinion, Biospeculo, he came up with this. These should be called wargs. Wargs are really cool. And, in fantasy, they're a really cool thing. You could have called them wargs. I have no idea why Colossal didn't decide to call them wargs or something similar to that, because it's one thing to state that they are a genetically modified wolf, and it's a proof of concept of many different things. Reading into, trying to figure out a bit more, they took DNA from blood, which is something that actually is a really big deal, because blood, in case you didn't know, blood cells don't have a nucleus. They don't carry DNA in them. So the ability, or they don't carry the same sort of DNA properties in them that other cells do. So the ability to take DNA from blood itself, a humongous step forward. Also, the sort of actual gene editing process that they did is different from CRISPR, from what I've heard. This is all from things that I've read on Twitter, different sort of articles that I've seen, and also a couple of videos, one from Raptor Chatter. Please go check out his channel, he's phenomenal, as well as 7 Days of Science, which I'm sure that you are aware of, but again, if you're not, go check out their channel too, and Wild World, another great channel, as well as a few others. I'll throw them up on screen too. But apparently the overall genetic editing that they took part in is different from the method that they used in terms of CRISPR itself. Instead of, splicing in something and sewing it back together like CRISPR does, they've gone and sort of edited it in a much different way. Again, a lot of this is going to be solved once we actually get a peer review, or an article for peer review. So until then, we can't really say much of anything as to what these animals are, but they're certainly not dire wolves, sadly. Though, hopefully someday we will actually get true anti-scion dire wolves, or dire dogs, as they are more appropriately named, I should say. But until then, for what we have right now, they just seem to be cute, big, white, fuzzy wolves. So that's it from me. I hope you guys enjoyed this little crash course. I sort of threw this video together really quickly, just because of the news breaking. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed the artwork. Please go check out everyone and everything that I've sort of referenced here. I'll also throw up all my references. It should be here right now. Ta-da! But yeah, and please go check out, people that I've shouted out, like Biospeculo on Instagram, Raptor Chatter, 7 Days of Science, everyone, all the people on Twitter who I've shown off, everyone and everything. And yeah, hopefully Colossal will get their act together a bit, and kind of tell us what the hell's going on. But until then, yeah, if you want to know more about these animals, please let me know in the comments below, and I will, maybe make a much more in-depth video, sort of going into the actual minutia and the actual ecological niches and the stuff that dire wolves, at least from the fossil record that we know of, are known for, and in a less ranty, more scripted, and better presented format. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed though. If you did, leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe for more, and I will see you all in the next one. Thanks for stopping into the den, and have a good day, guys.